Salam, dear sisters and brothers, and welcome back to another episode of the Radio Resistance podcast. As always, joined here by my dear co-host, Brother Zubair, and we've also got a very special guest with us here today, Mr. Richard Mackenzie. Zubair, you wanted to provide us a very brief introduction before we go ahead and get into it.
Yes, welcome everyone. I'd like to give a brief introduction. Mr. Richard Mackenzie is a veteran war correspondent, producer, an author, and analyst. His work ranges from trekking with the Afghan Mujahideen and their jihad against the Soviet Union to the Iran-Iraq War and Desert Storm. Since September 11, 2001, he has spent more than 4 years in Iraq and Afghanistan covering both wars. Mr. Mackenzie is also a public speaker. He's widely recognized as an authority on special forces, terrorism, Afghanistan, and international affairs. He has more than 18 years of experience traveling in Asia from 1985 to 1992. Mr. Mackenzie wrote 22 cover stories and numerous other articles as a senior writer for Insight magazine, as well as winning the National Headliner Award for outstanding coverage of a major news event, the Afghan War. Mr. Mackenzie also he's critically acclaimed film Afghanistan Revealed won a 2001 Emmy Award, as well as in New York Films Festivals, Medal, Golden Eagle, and other recognition. So Mr. Mackenzie also spent many years as a close friend and associate with Commander Ahmad Shah Massoud, who will be the subject of today's discussion. And so with no further ado, if I left anything out, obviously it will be covered in this episode. I know that was a very brief introduction for such an esteemed guest. So we would like to welcome Mr. Richard Mackenzie. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. And this obviously is another important date in remembering the life of and the work of Ahmad Shah Massoud and focusing on the needs of the people of Afghanistan.
Right. It's today being the 10th of September, we're on the eve of September 11th, and it's just a major event that shook the world, which was these two tragic events. One of them was losing one of the most revered figures in Afghanistan and the region, Ahmad Shah Massoud, and we know about his life, and we'll discuss that. And 2 days later, September 11th takes place. So we'll get into that. But let's start with just some general questions, Mr. Mackenzie. I guess if you want to maybe start with what was your first experience in Afghanistan?
Yeah, if you could help take us down memory lane, and when was that first trip in Afghanistan, and what was it that brought you there?
Sure. I was working as you said for Insight magazine. I was working in print at the time, and in the mid 1980s, and I had most of my career until then had been dealing with domestic American affairs. I was born in Australia, but I lived my adult life in the United States, and went to college in Dallas, Texas. And but when I was starting with Insight, I was basically covering the criminal justice system. And but the editor, one of the editors there, had a great idea to send me to India, which I was a little bit overwhelmed by. But I went to India, and they said, well, while you're there, just duck up the road to Pakistan and see what's going on there. And so I did. It wasn't so easy, of course, because Pakistan at that time was under military rule of General Zia. And but I got there, and then while in Pakistan, some Pakistani officials said, "Well, you really ought to go up to Peshawar and look at the plight of the Afghan people." And Afghanistan had not really been my focus to start with, but I followed the suggestion, went up to Peshawar and spent about a week there. Did not go into Afghanistan at that time, but met a lot of Afghans, and I came to understand in a very superficial way initially the situation that the Afghan people were facing with the at that time the occupation of the Soviet Union and the jihad that had begun um, against against that occupation, the resistance, to put it in more Western terms, and uh, I at that point I said to myself, I've got to come back here. I didn't have the time or the schedule to do it then, but I came back to Washington D.C. where I was working, and
How long was that first trip?
the the first trip was really only a month or two, or all together, and it was trying to get my head around India, its internal politics, Pakistan, its internal politics, and its global approach, and Afghanistan. So it was like trying to do a PhD in about half an hour or so. But I, I, I really, I really developed initially an affection for Afghanistan and a passion for the plight of what the Afghans were fighting, because I did get around the refugee camps and so forth in in Pakistan while I was there. So I came back to Washington, and it was, I'd say, a year or so. Um, I got an invitation to come back again, but this time to go into Afghanistan. And somebody said, "Well, there's a commander there in the north that nobody seems to be able to get to, and you know, he's very interesting. He's doing some great stuff." And of course, that was Massoud. I did hear just before I left that 60 Minutes, the American 60 Minutes, had considered going there, but sort of decided against it for two reasons. A, there were about two or three or more mountain ranges on the path that they would have to cross, but also the fact that he didn't speak English, so therefore um, that would not be good for their American audience. But I decided to give it a shot, and that was what I thought. Of course, was that I was told, "Oh, you'll get in and out in a couple of weeks, and you'll you can meet him and interview him, and then come back home." Uh, the 2 or 3 week trip became 4 months, and a lot of trial and tribulation.
Right. Yeah, no, I've heard you mention that in a different speech as well, about that 4 months. Initially you were expecting only a few weeks, but how was it that So you had heard, right, from with that 60 Minutes, there that interest from 60 Minutes to conduct an interview. Upon even hearing that, what was it, or how was it that you actually ended up reaching Commander Massoud for the first time?
I I got to Peshawar, and I there I met up with folks in the Jamiat office in Peshawar, and at the time when Professor Rabbani was there um, in Peshawar and heading up the Jamiat sort of operation, and the I met quite a lot of the Jamiat folks in Peshawar, and they arranged for me to go with a horseman, and there was others who got me up to Chitral and sort of sneaked me across the border, and uh, I made one terrible mistake along the way. Um, I drank the water in Chitral, and I, I did not recover from that. Uh, my body didn't recover from that for several months. Uh, if you go to Chitral, I do not recommend drinking the water. Uh,
Yeah.
but I got into Afghanistan, and on the trip in, as I say, I had pretty heavy duty stomach disease, but I eventually, it, I would say, the whole trip probably took just over 2 weeks to get in. Um, Finally, um, got into the Panjshir Valley, and there I started to meet some of Massouds infrastructure, um, uh, his commanders. He was not there at the time, but one of them told me, said, "You're a very lucky man. You've come at the right time." And this was, of course, just before Massoud's attack on the um, uh, the military bases in the north, and it was the army bases, the communist army bases that blocked the short route between the north and Pakistan.
Okay, so that first trip, or when you eventually made it to Panjshir, as you mentioned right now, Commander Massoud himself was not there, right? So how
Yeah,
about
he was not there, and but he was preparing for this uh, for the attack on the military base. So that was another few days of trekking through the mountains to go and join him at his location. I was finally able to get to him, and uh, I then I had a couple of weeks of waiting for him to come to the location I was at,
Mhm.
and nothing was smooth in timetables in Afghanistan, probably then or now. But I eventually was sitting in this little tiny hut one night, and there was a bustle at the door, and uh, I got two or three people walked in, and I was introduced for the first time to Ahmad Shah Massoud.
Oh no, that perseverance is something very admirable. You know, putting
Yeah,
through all those
I think it
difficulties
was
and
probably
challenges.
from the time I set out. It was probably over a month before I actually saw him face to face.
Okay, so and then when you did meet him, what was your first impression? You know, you mentioned that in Pakistan you had met with officials from the Jamiat party, right? And I'm sure
Along
you
the
got to.
way into Afghanistan, um, I had bumped into um, a, an eminent French scholar um, at, at a little clinic. I'd been very sick, as I said, and the horseman had sort of diverted and taken me to a clinic that was being run at the time by an American doctor who was a woman who was um, vaccinating children against measles in Nuristan. And while they're being sort of taken care of, given some antibiotics, this eminent French scholar, Olivier Roy, had arrived on his way out from seeing Massoud. And I was very, very fortunate to have met him, because I sort of sat with him for about 2 days, and he gave me his total briefing on Massoud. And he said that you'll meet nobody else like him in Afghanistan. He's an exceptional person, an exceptional leader. And so I was quite prepared in that sense for how important and how much Massoud had to offer. And so when I met him, he lived up to that promise in my initial conversations.
Okay. That's very
And
nice to hear.
I'm sorry. I also was. I thought in that first moment that he looked very much like Bob Dylan, but that was.
That's funny. There's a footage. Um, I actually recently saw this. There was a footage of Commander Massoud, um, and actually his son, the leader of the National Resistance Front, Ahmad Massoud, boarding a helicopter with you. Now, when was
Yeah.
this?
This I was fortunate in my exposure to Ahmad Shah Massoud, because I saw him repeatedly over the years. As this first trip that I described to you was in 1987. Went back again in 1989, and then every year or so, and had dozens and dozens of hours of interviews with him over those years. And in 1989, I had spent another long time with him. That was when he was occupied Taliban, and that was sadly just after the massacre at Tangi Fakar, when the entire leadership of his infrastructure was captured and assassinated. And then in 1993, I had other trips along the way, but in 1993, I went back there for the first time as a television producer. I went with a CNN team. There was Peter Bergen was another producer on the trip, and Peter Juvenile was the cameraman, and we went in to Afghanistan to to do a story largely about the emergence of terrorism training groups there, and under other auspices, and we of course wanted to talk to Massoud and to get his opinions and his concerns about that very issue. And so we went to see him in, in the north, and one of the things we wanted to do was to get some footage of the Panjshir Valley, and he very generously said, "Well, you can take my helicopter and you can fly up and down the Panjshir and in the helicopter and film from that." And as we were returning, we came back, and that's when he came to join us. And he had his little son with him, Ahmad. And that was the first time I met Ahmad. I saw him a couple of other times in later years, but the first time, I think he was more probably quite terrified of this weird guy who'd come out of the helicopter in a suit and didn't speak his language, but tried to say hello to him, but he wasn't. I don't think he was particularly interested. But we got some really wonderful footage of the valley and of the father and son together. It was, I think, a good memory to be kept. Then I later saw Ahmad. I think it would have been about, I think it was 96 or something like that. It was not. It was about half a dozen years later, and I was at Massoud's house in the Panjshir, and was sitting around. There was a group of Mujahideen who I knew quite well from over the years, and they came in and sat down, and Ahmad was with them, and one of them said, "Ahmad's really curious about you. He's got some questions," and I said, "Oh, sure. What are they?" And one of the Mujahideen says, he wants to know why you're not a Muslim. Ahmed, when he was 6 or 7 or whatever he was at that time, was a little concerned about me not being a Muslim.
Wow.
I tried to explain to him that I was still a person of the book.
Interesting. Very nice. Okay. Yeah. So, okay. So we have a few different questions in relation to different kinds of eras or different times that you did spend in Afghanistan.
Please.
And yeah, I think we can go ahead and start with those questions.
Please.
Yeah, and the first of those being, so towards the first trip of yours to Afghanistan, and even prior to you having arrived in Afghanistan, the social political climate was primarily one where everything was surrounding around the Soviet-Afghan war, right? So, can you tell us a little bit about the political climate regarding the Soviet-Afghan war? So, but specifically from like a Western point of view, what was it like?
It's an interesting question, and it's one that I've actually reflected back on quite a lot lately, because the the attitude, certainly in the United States, was definitely one of support for the Afghan people. Um, it's interesting that the most conservative leaders in the United States at that time were the most supportive of the Afghan people and of their resistance. Um, there was Ronald Reagan. Well, backing up, President Jimmy Carter was in charge. Was the president in when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and he did start some support. However, probably the strongest support for the Afghan resistance came from President Reagan, a very conservative leader. And I remember a quote from Senator Byrd, who was probably from West Virginia, one of the most conservative members of Congress. He said, I kind of like the Afghan people. They don't cotton to the idea of foreigners coming in and occupying their country and destroying their farms and, attacking their women and etc. He said, they sort of remind me of folks back in West Virginia. And that was the type of conservative sort of thinking that contributed to the support, and therefore it was easy, relatively, for some of the most conservative leaders to get the Afghan resistance supplied with Stinger anti-aircraft missiles. The thought of giving that type of weaponry to any resistance today has probably made quite a turn. I think even for Ukraine, it's not necessarily as simple as it once was. That it was in effect a simpler time. What you're asking about, people here saw it very much as a resistance against an invasion. The world changed in lots of different respects, and I think it wasn't so simple, perhaps, during the American time in Afghanistan.
Right. That's a very interesting analysis of the situation, especially because, what's the situation today, it's, sort of different in the sense that America kind of left behind Afghanistan to this, terrorist organization, and now there's a resistance there now, but sometimes we see a differing of opinion from whether it's people from analysts or people outside the country. But in regards to the resistance at that time, can you maybe tell us about, being on the ground there? How did you see the actual resistance organized against the Soviet Union? And were they all united on this matter? Were the people of were the people of Afghanistan at least supportive against, in resisting against this occupation of, communism?
Well, the biggest problem that Afghanistan faced, I would venture to say, was Pakistan. it was, yes, there was a massive problem of the Soviet Union occupying the country. I mean, that goes unsaid. But in terms of a resistance against the Soviets, you know, it it was it was Pakistan, because the, the Pakistanis controlled who got what, who got the weapons, who got the cash, who got the what it took to stand up against a superpower. Um, so it was, in that regard, was the resistance united? No, not at all. It was it was seven different resistance parties at least. you know, um, uh, in most of them engineered and controlled by and out of Pakistan. Um, you know, Ahmad Shah Massoud, I venture to say, stood alone um, as a resistance leader who was not dominated or controlled uh, by Pakistan, and who would not submit to their dictates. He one of the things he once said to me, he said, you look around the world at all the different resistance groups that have tied themselves to uh, foreign countries that have submitted to, and he just sort of listed off one after another, you know, whether it was in Iraq, or whether it was in India, or the Tamils and so forth. And he said that they're all doomed to fail, you know. So he he knew he knew what was happening, and uh, it was his goal, I think, to stand certainly independent.
Yeah, that reminds me of that very famous quote of his that we will never be a pawn in somebody else's game, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And sadly, Afghanistan had been the sort of the the like the chessboard, or for great games from the time of the British and others there in the region, that he was not prepared to.
Unfortunately, arguably even till today, right?
Very much so. Very much so.
Um, um, yeah, on that note, actually, something that I was meaning to ask a little bit later, but I guess we can go ahead and ask right now. It's kind of related. Um, I know that you were engaged and involved in photography as well, right? Um, so, uh, you know, Masoud's image as being among his people and his men, right? Even during the toughest of times, um,
Mm.
I we know that this was neither staged nor a show. It was just because of how much people actually admired him, right? But
Oh,
if you could speak
absolutely.
on that for a bit, because there, ever since those times and up until now, there's all sorts of propaganda, whether it was due to stemming from different political factions or groups, like Hizb Islami, for example, Hikmatyar, and so on. This is one of the things that up until today we see that is being propagated, right? um, why would you what would you say was the reason for um, all of these pictures coming out for this figure. There's so much, there are so many images, there's so much coverage, right? But we don't see the same for some of the other, um, what,
Because he had something to cover. There was something there. There was a there. He was an intelligent, uh, uh, fascinating man, and who truly loved his people, and who was who just wanted to serve, um, his people, and that I met all the other leaders. I spent a little bit of time even with Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who uh, described me at one press conference as an enemy of Islam. That kind of put a little chill in me in the streets of Peshawar for a while. But um,
well, well,
you know,
well,
it there was a there. There was substance and and a sense of humor and an affection for his people and a leadership, And I saw him and lived with him for a while in the most difficult times. I mean, I was with him back in the mountains, as I told you before, and then in Taliban when he was uh, occupying that area and recovering from the assassinations and the tragedy of the Tangi Fakar massacres. Uh, I was with him in the streets of Kabul, when after he occupied Kabul, when at that time when Hekmatyar and his people were were bombing the city, and you could get hundreds of rockets before breakfast, into the city, and Massoud was trying so hard uh, to stave that off. And then, I was with him again when when he was outside the city. Uh, last time I saw him was in 1996, and I kept in touch after that. But the, uh, the last time I saw him in person was in '96.
uh,
Yeah,
we wanted to ask about that actually, but can you go into that a little bit? What was the situation? I mean, 96. So prior to the Taliban's taking of power, or what?
yeah. I mean, um, I at the end I saw him just before the Taliban um, uh, came um, into Kabul, and it was it was kind of doomed. The situation was doomed at that point, I think, because of the disunity that you were talking about before, or that you were asking about before, the disunity amongst all the different Mujahideen groups, that you know Hekmatyar was supposed to protect the approach from the road toward Jalalabad, and that it just it, it was going to end at that point, and it did. But I go back uh, to '92, um, when when he was in a house in Wazir and was trying to bring some semblance of order to the city. And it was a terrible challenge. It was really, really tough. And he would be going 20 hours a day and more. I often didn't know how he was able to do it physically, but he did.
Wow. So, okay. So you mentioned, different groups kind of doing different things, like the disunity. And you mentioned Hikmatyar and rockets coming into Kabul. I think this is a good point to a good we can segue into the idea or the government of what came after the Soviet invasion, right? So at this point, Russia, Soviet Union, technically they lose, right? They lost the war, they withdraw, and some time goes by, and this new government is formed, right? Led by President Rabbani. I might have left some stuff out in between. Feel free to cover that if you may. So at this point, the role of Ahmad Shah Massoud was defense minister. So his role is to defend this city that in essence this country that he spent 10 years, with blood, sweat, and tears fighting for, losing so many people, fighting this superpower, this evil force of communism. Now that he is the defense minister, right? Sometimes, as Kumail was mentioning earlier, there's people. It's a very small fraction of people, usually from within Afghanistan, people that probably had ties to the communist regime, or listen to other types of propaganda and stuff. They'll place the blame on Ahmad Shah Massoud. They'll put them all together and say, "Oh, these jihadi leaders destroyed the city." What is your take on that, in the sense that Hikmatyar is bombing the city, and this is a legitimate government, and Massoud is the defense minister? So
yeah. I mean, I was living there in the middle of all of that, and what was every last one of his guys, perfect, and did they never do any make any mistakes or do any harm? No, of course not. They're human beings, but the destruction, the utter destruction of Kabul in those days is undeniably on the plate of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and of elements in Pakistan. There's no doubt in my heart and soul about that. None at all. It was Massoud, just another jihadi who was as bad as Hekmatyar? I don't know. Hell no. I mean, it was that to say that is ludicrous.
right, that's pretty much what I would think common sense would tell you that. But the fact that you were there and you experienced it and you saw it firsthand, that says a lot. Um,
Yeah,
that being
you're 100% right, and I wasn't obviously for a moment suggesting that thought was coming from you, but you were asking about it, and I know what you're talking about. I know it very well, that the elements who sort of say, you know, Massoud was just another quote warlord, you know.
right.
Since when? Since when will we start calling Charles de Gaulle a warlord for defending the French resistance? And in World War II. That
That was a
doesn't make doesn't
very,
make sense.
very great comparison there. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Um, yeah. Okay. So that covers. I mean, of course, there's so much more we can get into regarding the Soviet-Afghan War and also what came after as well. But as we're approaching closer to our 1 hour mark now, there's a few kind of core questions I wanted to or we'd like to get to. So
Please.
so so now past the formation of this new government, Azerbaijan mentioned with President Rabbani being the president and Commander Massoud having reached and become the defense minister. Um, so then we see post the destruction of Kabul, due to the absolute chaos of the time, the grounds became very somewhat easy for the Taliban to take over. And I guess at that time it was truly a takeover, unlike today's handover, right? But so what in your perspective, what was Commander Massoud's struggle with the Taliban 1.0, if we're going to call them that, right? What was his struggle with the Taliban like, and how did you perceive life under um, that new de facto regime, or whatever we'd like to call it?
The I wonder how much difference there is between Taliban 1.0 and 2.0, or you know, God help us, 3.0, whatever. The the difference between Massoud and the Taliban was was that they were just so adamant and locked into their fundamentalist ways, for want of a better phrase. Um, I have trouble with the word fundamentalist because the fundamentals of Islam are what they are, and yet, um, the one of the things that Massoud said to me in a very early interview, one of the early discussions I had with him, I was asking him about the role of women and the need for women to wear certain clothing, and we were discussing about that type of rules and regulations. And the interesting thing that he said was, that it was a cultural thing, he felt, rather than religious dictates, that different parts of the country of Afghanistan would have different attitudes toward uh, these type of questions. And he was saying, here you will see this, but over there you will see that, and so he was of course open-minded, and as staunch and as importantly a Muslim as he was, that his 6-year-old son wanted to chastise me for not being a Muslim. Um, but he was he was firm in his beliefs that he wasn't, locked into. Basically, the Taliban struck me at, at the very beginning, and it's also continued into today, as an attitude and a group that did not emerge from Afghanistan, but emerged from Afghan refugee camps in Pakistan. And as I've said, about Pakistan being to blame for a lot of what went wrong, yes, very much so. Both in their sort of selfish ambitions and their xenophobic fear of India and their desire to have a country and an administration that they could control on that side of their geography, i.e., Afghanistan's side, but also a cultural thing that came out of the refugee camps that influenced, you know, the whole idea of blacking out windows and that sort of stupidity that was brought in the Taliban 1.0, in their first rule in Afghanistan. Um, that's clearly out of a refugee camp, not out of Afghan culture, um, not even Kandahari culture.
That's a very
Absolutely.
that's a
Mhm.
very good point.
Yeah.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
now, I'm sorry, the Taliban today, I I don't know. I mean, that their whole attitude toward toward women, girls, education, um, it's just it's so terribly sad.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually wanted to ask, as just a follow up. So Commander Massoud famously alludes to a threat from these fundamentalists, right? Um, and Do you see a corollary to this in today's Afghanistan?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Of course. Um, the big challenge, the challenging question today, though, is what do we do about it? What can be done about it? You know, the Ahmad Shah Massoud's answer at the time was he had been fighting the Soviet Union, and that had become a way of life, and and it was valid, and it was the thing to do, as any resistance would against an invasion of their country. You got another invasion of the country, in a sense, from the Taliban uh, out of Pakistan, and yes, he went on fighting for Afghanistan in that regard. You know, he,
Yeah.
I mean, he did not get anywhere near the type of support that 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 the anti-Soviet forces got. Um, the but um, there was some support. I don't know what is to be found today. I'm I'm very concerned. You know, I I think I think there's got to be a resistance against the Taliban. Um, the 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 format and the formation of that, and the direction and the strength of that is a tough road to hoe.
Yeah. Fortunately, however, we have the one of the um, because his legacies are plenty, but one of his living legacies being his son, who took a very similar stance to that of his father's.
Yeah.
But I asked this because today specifically, right? Hopefully, we get this episode produced and published in the next day or two. But today, we're on the eve of 9/11, right? In
Yes.
between what would be arguably considered well, at least in my lifetime, one of the most significant tragedies um, I've experienced. Right, 9/9 being the tragic martyrdom of Commander Massoud, and as an Afghan American, 9/11 being the biggest terrorist attack against our nation here. And both of which were plotted and executed by the same perpetrators, right? Al-Qaeda terrorists who were being provided safe haven by the Taliban, whether 1.0, 2.0, as you joked earlier, maybe 3.0. This is what they do, right?
Yeah.
Being that you were a close associate or actually a friend of Commander Massoud, I'd like to ask how did you process the loss of this great man? And then not
It
even
was,
two days later, 9/11 as well, right?
yeah.
Um,
That 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 ghastly week is burned in my memory, and it's something that I will live with in my memory as long as God decides to keep me here on this planet. The I I got the phone call about Massoud before before 9/11 had occurred. It was from a friend in Afghanistan who said, I can't tell you too much now, but you should prepare yourself for the fact that we have lost the commander." And I I knew about it, very soon after it happened, and it was it was uh, it was devastating, and uh, it was very sad, obviously, but also it was very concerning about where things were headed. And then, of course, uh, the, the 9/11 events, which started off, I thought, oh, a traffic reporter plane has bumped into the side of the World Trade Center or something like this. Wow, that's something. And then it developed and it developed, and uh, it I realized that at that point, the world had changed much more than in that week than we could have imagined. It was devastating.
Yeah, that's I had a very similar experience as well. Living in New York, I remember I think I was in the fifth grade when that happened, and same thing. I remember first it was just there was no confirmation of Amir Sahib, Ahmad Shah Massoud being killed, being martyred
Mm,
on September 9th, but there was a lot of buzz. Like we got phone calls from family and stuff, and there was just something going around saying something has happened.
mm,
But I think many people, Afghan Americans, we didn't even get to process that. There was a lot of buzz going on, and then, of course, these attacks happened. And I think it was early in the morning. I was in class, and we got news that something had happened. And by the end of the day, it was when we went home and stuff. The next day, just coming into school, the reaction from my classmates and just people in general, it was because people knew I was from Afghanistan. I remember just like a few days before we were like talking about where we're from and stuff, and of
mm.
course that word just became this like a boogeyman type of
Yeah.
term, right? The Taliban, Afghanistan, Bin Laden. Um, but
Yeah.
and for those for
Americans,
those who
sadly,
don't
I was just going to say, sadly, Americans don't necessarily always handle that um, that type of thing very well. There were Sikhs being beaten up in the streets for their role in the World Trade Center, which is pretty ludicrous. But
Right.
yeah, but then again, I, I think America set out with good intentions to rectify what had happened and how that terrorism that you mentioned had been fostered and trained and developed in Afghanistan under the Taliban. But sadly, the 20 years that followed weren't particularly always handled very well.
Yeah, I mean, it was a tragic event. So people acting the way they did and reacting and their emotions. I mean, emotions were high. A lot of people were killed. So I guess now that we're reaching the end of our episode, this episode was revolving around those two incidents, specifically, losing our great commander, Ahmad Shah Massoud, and the event of 9/11 that took place, and the rest, that unfolded what happened in Afghanistan for the next 20 years, and what we see happening today is all a result of that day. So I guess we want to express our. Mhm.
Just a quick comment that I would like to make is that Commander Massoud, famously on multiple occasions had pre-warned of the attacks that were going to come, and just drawing that corollary between today, again, is this living legacy, his one and only son, who took the stance and formed this national resistance front of Afghanistan. He's been providing the same exact warnings. Hopefully, uh, day in and day out, we're all praying, those who are supporters of the National Resistance Front, that the world listens this time.
Yeah.
Hopefully, it doesn't take another tragic event, another tragedy like that, for us to, for our countries, for our nations to take action
For
and
the world to pay attention. Sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So
I do. As I said before, I think Ahmed and the resistance organization have a tough road ahead, but then so did Ahmad Shah Massoud fighting the Soviet Union.
right, and this year for the commemoration for his martyrdom that is taking place all around the world, the Massoud Foundation um, chose a slogan or motto, which was one of the a quote of the late Commander Massoud, which in Farsi he says "Bashim nabashim muqawamat idama darad," which, whether we are here or not, the resistance continues, right? And I think that this is a very timely. It was a perfect time to select such a quote as the slogan for this year's commemorative events.
Very appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, Zobarjan, you're saying we did exceed our um, hour mark, and I believe Mr. Mackenzie does have another speaking engagement coming up. So um, uh, we Mr. Mackenzie, we have plenty more questions actually, and I very much enjoyed. It was an honor and it was a pleasure of mine um,
It's
to
my
have
great
you here.
pleasure to be with you.
Hopefully, before we do sign off, it would be nice to on this session get a promise that perhaps we can have a second follow-up episode at some time when your schedule permits, as well.
Anytime. Anytime. I'd always be happy to be with you guys.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mackenzie. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for being with us. Mr. Mackenzie, if you had any closing remarks, anything that you wanted to say, whether regarding this Commander Ahmad Shah Massoud, or a message to the people of Afghanistan. Any closing remarks? Please go ahead, and we'll end on that.
I would just say thank you to the people of Afghanistan for having me in your lives, to giving me the opportunity to get to know Afghanistan, and to get to know the Afghan people. I would just say to them that you should have the faith and the strength that you've always demonstrated, and God willing, this too will pass. Bamana Hoda, Hodafez.
Tashakkur. Tashakkur. And thank you, and God bless. Take care.
God bless you.
Khadafis.
Bamana Hoda.